Chiropractors, unlike physical therapists and all the other therapists out there, don't say, take all the drugs prescribed, do exactly what your medical doctor does, get in line for surgery, make sure you still get the surgery, do everything the medical doctor tells you, and in addition to that, get a chiropractic adjustment. That's not what we do. That's why we're such a threat. That's why we're attacked so much. What chiropractors say is, wait a minute, those drugs don't have any evidence of effectiveness. Long-term, they actually mess up your ability to control your own inflammation and pain. Dangerous. They ruin your gut. They have all kinds of other problems. Look at Vioxx, look at, opioids. Surgery is terrible. So you should get chiropractic care instead of. So we represent an enormous threat to their monopoly of money and the monopoly of authority. That's why we're attacked.
James Chestnut, welcome to the Marketing Your Practice podcast. How are you, my friend?
I'm well. Thank you. Nice to see you again. It's been a while.
Always a pleasure to be chatting with you. Yeah, the last time we caught up was in person at your Sydney event. You came over here to teach. Again, was that an evidence-based? Was that what that event was called?
Yeah, evidence-based chiropractic protocols or chiropractic lifestyle protocols,
Yeah.
Basically just evidence-based protocols. I'm trying to get people to realize if they follow the evidence, they're actually going to end up exactly where we want them. Most people think that, erroneously, they think the evidence-based side is on the, 3 to 5 visit, pain only side, where in fact, the evidence is really absolutely unequivocally to the model of chiropractic, which you and I adhere to and both teach.
Yeah. I had the pleasure of taking my son along, Ed, who's in 4th year at that stage, and to have him exposed to that stuff that was wonderful. It was a very proud father moment for me. In today, I want to really continue that conversation.
Sure.
I've noticed there's a real, there are many different practice management, communication, marketing, lots of different strategies out there. One thing in common with chiropractors who are able to help their patients and build a really ethical, healthy practice is they have a great certainty and confidence in what they do. There's just an ownership of it. In fact, I think I heard you talk in a conversation with Brad Klawacki, a mutual friend of ours too, about the ethical millionaire or something like that as well.
Yeah, on one of our podcasts,
The side effect of us knowing the science, having the certainty, looking after our patients, helping them get results is a really big thriving practice and a wealthy life too as well. But that is missing for so many of us. During the day that we had together up in Sydney, I just want to jump straight into this. One of the things I found really fascinating and for you to really dive into was the Magna Report. Magna, is that was?
Manga, yeah, M-A-N-G-A.
Yes. So I wonder whether we could, we being you, whether you could kind of share the journey of how that came about, the results from that paper, and what that might mean for us as chiropractors in helping to build the foundation of certainty and confidence in practice.
Sure. It was actually the paper that got me to become a chiropractor. Like, I read that before. I had just finished a graduate degree in neurophysiology. I'd had a bad rugby injury and I was kind of debating. I'd been accepted to do a PhD and, I had this terrible rugby injury and then long story, I ended up at a chiropractor and I was just intrigued by it. Unfortunately, the explanation the chiropractor gave me was nonsensical, but they didn't know I was doing a graduate degree in neurophysiology. But anyway, a buddy of mine whose dad's a plastic surgeon, actually, who I was a rugby guy, mate of mine, who ended up. I went to the physical therapist for the team for the university ended up telling me just go to a chiropractor. Everybody knows the story that when they go to a chiropractor, it makes a difference, and it made a huge difference in my life immediately. And then, probably 50% better right away. And then, kept going. But anyway, I started thinking about it and I was, everyone I talked to, my dad's a PhD and all the PhDs I was, I was dealing with at university were like, what? Chiropractic, like you guarantee you got this fellowship to you to go do a PhD, kind of why would you do that? And of course, I've always been the personality, which is unlikely to be, influenced by people's opinion. And I would say, well, where'd you read that? Anyway, this guy gave me the Magna Report and it just it blew in. I didn't know the background story of it, which I'm happy to share if you like, but the Magna Report
Yeah.
itself was absolutely jaw-dropping. I mean, that was 1990, probably 1995. I read that. It came out in 93. So it was like
Yes.
fresh, and it was absolutely jaw-dropping for anybody willing to read it, like jaw-dropping. And so, and it's funny. I was at a seminar with Brad, and there's a guy said something. Well, isn't the Magna Report kind of old? Like, is it still hold up? And I just laughed and I just said, yeah, well, so is E equals MC squared and Newton's laws. Jackass. So anyway, we had a good laugh about it because you know in science, it's not how long something's been around. It's whether or not something else came along to refute it. So, people who don't know science say, well, that paper's old. It doesn't matter. That's not how it works. If nothing else comes along to take its place or a replication of that, study doesn't come along and show that it's not consistent results, well, then the paper stays. And of course, the Magna Report, there's been nothing new to replace it. So, the fact that it was done in 1993 is not relevant. There's been no new evidence-based interventions added to the chiropractic scope of practice, to physical therapy scope of practice, or to medical scope of practice since 1993. In fact, the only things that have been added lack evidence of effectiveness and have, in many cases, a lot of evidence of harm. So anyway, would you like me to give the sort of little story behind it? Like, what do you want? What do you want me to share?
Yeah, I would love to, because the story behind it brings some context into how it came about, why it came about, and then we can talk about the results. So I think they're all really important in chiropractors understanding, what was this?
I do too. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll tell you the story. I'll tell you something that's really important to think about, Angus, is that if they replicated the Magna Report now, we would not have the same results because so few chiropractors are adjusting in Canada now, coming out of the school in Canada. And so basically the reason chiropractors were able to come together so uniformly and as such a tribe and community to deal with this, in the story I'm going to tell in a minute, was because they all shared the fact that basically they adjusted. That chiropractors might have adjusted for different reasons. Some were taken, were freeing innate, and others were very, musculoskeletal, but they all adjusted. And the Magna Report was really not a comparison of ART and ultrasound and IFC and rub-a-dub and all these other things against medicine and physical therapy. The Magna Report was a systematic review of SMT or adjustment versus the rest. And that would not happen today. Probably not anywhere around the world, but especially in Canada. And in fact, I know a guy who does, practice reviews every 5 years in Canada. I don't know, it's probably the same in Australia. You have to, someone comes in and randomly picks a couple of your files just to make sure your record keeping's up to date or whatever. Well, 98% of the files he looked at didn't include one adjustment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's in Ontario.
Wow.
So you have to understand what's coming out now. And so and when you understand that the evidence for chiropractic is really the evidence for adjusting, that's where our evidence comes from. That's the only thing that allows us to be evidence-based. And so when you realize that that's missing, you can just realize now how what an awful state our profession is in, that we wouldn't even be able to replicate the findings of the Magna Report now. I mean, that's devastating.
Yeah. In 30
So
years.
anyway, the story is in the late 80s, they call it the Mercedes 80s. I always think that's funny. Because what happened in Ontario and a few other provinces in Canada was that they didn't pay fully for chiropractic, but they removed a lot of the financial disincentive. So just imagine if chiropractic was fully covered, how many people would use it, right? So the reason medicine tries to maintain their monopoly of authority and says all these terrible things about chiropractic is because they want to maintain their monopoly of reimbursement. And what they know is if they don't include us in universities, if they don't include us in the socialized healthcare, and they don't include us in the third-party payer to the same way, that undermines our authority, which undermines our ability for our patients to get paid. And most patients will take what's free over what works, especially if they don't even know yet what works, right? So, and, we can't tell people they get 6 months off work for back surgery, or they get, so all of that authority is removed from us. But as soon as you remove that financial disincentive, everybody goes to the chiropractor.
Yes.
Yeah, because our effectiveness and patient satisfaction is very high. Our cultural authority is low. And the reason our cultural authority is low is because our reimbursement is low. They go hand in hand. People think what gets reimbursed by the government is real. And so it's diabolically, clever and evil, but this is kind of what they do. So anyway, in Canada, like in Australia, we have a socialized healthcare system, meaning that anybody who is building that system is a public, basically is working for the government, and their salary can be, published. So basically what happens is that people were publishing the incomes of, GPs, chiropractors, anybody who was in the socialized system. Well, what they did was when they took away the disincentive for chiropractic care, and again, they weren't paying for it fully, and I maybe it was 12 is, I can't remember the story. I don't want to pretend I remember in detail, but it was reasonable. It took away, people were basically able to go sort of like 12 times or whatever it was and get a reasonable, reimbursement it was covered, right? And so out of pocket was much, much less. And so what happened was they started publishing these chiropractors' incomes, and they were far greater than a lot of GPs, because of course people were flocking to them because it was working, as we know it does. And what does a GP do for somebody with a spinal problem? I mean, nothing. They give a painkiller. It's like a dentist giving somebody a painkiller for a cavity. It's absurd beyond belief. And so people, obviously it wasn't working. They went to chiropractors. But the medical group, the GPs and the medical association and the pharmaceutical lobby was upset by it, because again, what I always point out is that chiropractors aren't instead of practitioners. Chiropractors, unlike physical therapists and all the other therapists out there, don't say, take all the drugs prescribed, do exactly what your medical doctor does, get in line for surgery, make sure you still get the surgery, do everything the medical doctor tells you, and in addition to that, get a chiropractic adjustment. That's not what we do. That's why we're such a threat. That's why we're attacked so much. What chiropractors say is, wait a minute, those drugs don't have any evidence of effectiveness. Long term, they actually mess up your ability to control your own inflammation and pain. They're dangerous. They ruin your gut. They have all kinds of other problems. Look at Vioxx, look at, opioids. Surgery is terrible. So you should get chiropractic care instead of. So we represent an enormous threat to their monopoly of money and their monopoly of authority. That's why we're attacked. And so we were attacked. And so what they did was they said the Medical Association in Ontario lobbied the Ontario government to remove any coverage for chiropractors. And what the chiropractors did was they said they actually got together, because chiropractors got along in those days. Why did they get along? Because in order for any group to get along, you have to have a shared common belief or activity. And their common activity or belief was that the adjustment was what was synonymous with chiropractic. That was in the 1990s. That was true. And in fact, all the way up until fairly recently, that was true. And so they all agreed and got together, and they got their patients to sign a petition in their offices. They had these petitions, and their patients would sign it saying, we don't want you to take away our coverage of chiropractic. And so thousands and thousands of signatures were given to the Ontario government. And all of a sudden, the Ontario government, remember, a successful politician is defined as one who gets reelected. Right. And so that what they realized was, for every kind of signature there's many more, that we have to pay attention to. So they said, we're not sure this is such a good idea. It might affect whether or not we get reelected. We didn't realize that the level of support and how many people were utilizing these services. And of course, the medical association was like, yeah, there is a lot of people using that services, and it's, it's terrible. And blah. So they basically said, well, then what you need to do is write, do an independent commission, basically, or commission somebody to do an independent review to show the chiropractic's useless and that it's dangerous. Just like, remember, at this time, the Wilkes case was still going on in the United States, where where medicine, the Wilkes case was 87, but then they were appealing it, and then they appealed it, and the appellate court found in favor of chiropractic, and then they tried to appeal it again to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, we're not even going to listen to it. It's a joke. But what they found was that the Medical Association tried to put forward a patient defense model, saying that they were just trying to protect patients. And of course, they were found guilty of lying about all that. And what they were really trying to do is maintain a monopoly. Right. And so they got busted. And But at the same time, so what they said was, well, put the patient defense thing through, just show that chiropractic's useless. So what they did was they hired a guy by the name of Pran Manga, and Pran Manga was a PhD public health professor, very, very highly regarded and respected, not just in Canada, but around the world. And they hired him to do what was at the time, and probably likely still is, the most thorough review of literature in the history of the world regarding back pain, interventions for back pain. And so he didn't know anything about chiropractic, and he said, of course, they're going to pay him. So him and a team of a few others said, yeah, let's do it. So they did. And when they came back with their report, it was absolutely jaw-dropping condemnation of medicine for their lack of evidence and their lack of safety, and an absolute, sort of endorsement of chiropractic and its safety record, its patient satisfaction record, and I might add, its cost effectiveness. In 1993, they estimated that it would save the Ontario government about $3.5 billion. Let me say that again, in 1993 dollars, $3.5 billion a year if they covered more of chiropractic. Manga said that chiropractic should be the gatekeepers of anybody with like spinal problems from work accident or a car accident. He said they should immediately be in universities. He said they should immediately be in hospitals. It was an incredible, incredible, jaw-dropping document, right? And so made all these recommendations. And of course, what happened was the government got lobbied hard by Big Pharma and the Ontario Medical Association, which has no money. They get all their money from pharma. And they didn't implement one single recommendation from this report they paid for. They commissioned and paid for themselves. And lo and behold, they defunded chiropractic.
It makes me think about, if that report suggests that there's a $3.5 billion savings and they were prepared to not take that on, what is the kickback that they're therefore getting? Because it would have come down to some kind of, all right, we can save $3.5 billion here, and if we do that, we're going to not get money from the pharmaceuticals, we're not get monies for this, which is obviously worth even more. Like, the power that must have been along with that for them to make that decision is stunning.
Well, and a couple of things, Angus. One is that $3.5 billion wasn't coming out of the politician's pocket. It was coming out of the taxpayer pocket. In a socialized healthcare system, that $3.5 billion is tax revenue. Whereas the money they're getting from Big Pharma goes right into their pocket. It goes right into their campaign. It goes right into, as you know, everything else. And so, it was basically what they said was, we're going to be primaried by these people who are going to fund other candidates. Like, with the pressure that gets applied. And so what it clearly wasn't was anything to do with evidence. And to this day, there's chiropractors who still think there's more evidence for medicine and physical therapy than there is for chiropractic. And of course, that's probably true if chiropractic is physical therapy. If chiropractic's the adjustment or SMT, no one can come close to us, and we can have a long talk about that if you like. But so that was an incredible story. And for me, of course, I was at the time fresh in doing graduate research work, right? So I was in the middle of my own conducting and design. I was awarded a research grant and ended up publishing my own study. So I was, one of the things I'm just luckily really good at is research methodology. I actually hate research. I find it boring. I love reading research. It takes me 5 minutes to read a paper. It takes a year to do it. Right. I just have no interest in it whatsoever. The minutia of it is to me, it's like computer programming. I don't care. It's just thousands and thousands of hours to produce something which I could read in half an hour. Right. So I never enjoyed that part of it. I love the teach. I taught at university too. I love the teaching. I love the research. I love reading research, and I love, figuring out if it's real or not. Are their conclusions matching, their methodology and all those things that I found fascinating. Like lawyer, you're really trying to find out if they're, but so anyway, but I was fresh out of that, and then to read that Magna report and to realize. And of course, it was at the same time where one of the big decision points for me, whether or not I was going to do a PhD or go to chiropractic college, was what I was going to study for my PhD, and I had several offers, some from the States, some from Canada, because I wanted to study how to prevent falls in the elderly. And of course, the way you prevent falls in the elderly is with neurology. It's sensory motor integration. It's a faster reaction time, and building strength. But the way you build strength is neurology. I was the first person on earth to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that changes in strength in untrained individuals was all neurological.
Yes.
But I was able to prove that because I was given the use of the MRI. And at the time, I was the first guy to publish using the MRI. Everybody else is using muscle biopsies, which is only an estimate of what's going on in the muscle. So I could show that there was no change in muscle hypertrophy, but there was a significant change in strength. So it had to be neural drive. So that was what I was a real expert in it at the time. And so I wanted to show that I could improve, reduce falls in the elderly. 50% of those people end up dying within a year. And I wanted to, and I had just a real interest in it. And I knew that I could prove that I could basically reduce these falls to almost nothing with a very, very inexpensive way to get the elderly in and get them exercising. I could teach them how to do it first, and then they'd go off and do it on their own. Well, it turned out I couldn't get paid for that. So I had this vision, like back then I had this vision of the clinic I was going to open. I don't want to get too long in the story, but I mean, I'm, if you know me a little bit, I'm like, I don't do things random. I plan things, and I had it done. And I knew I was going to be successful. And I knew the work I was going to do was going to be very unique. And I knew that I would be the world's leading experts on how to prevent falls in the elderly, 100% guaranteed. And so I was trying to figure out how I was going to get paid. And I actually had a conversation with the medical services plan. It's called MSP here. And I had a conversation with a woman there. And I was saying to her, listen, I'm debating what I'm going to do, but I'm going to be a PhD. I'm going to be a world's leading expert in this. I'm going to be able to prevent all these falls. How do I get people to get reimbursed for this? It's going to save the system billions of dollars. She said, you can't. You cannot get reimbursed. And I said, what if I can prove that I'm the guy who does it? I can prove the outcomes are there. She goes, it doesn't matter. You will not get reimbursed unless you're a licensed healthcare practitioner, and you can't be one unless you're a medical doctor or a chiropractor, right? I think physical therapy was another one, but physical therapists never did anything. Like, they weren't allowed to bill for that kind of stuff. And so she basically said, yeah, our hands are tied. The medical lobby is so strong on that I said, but medical doctors aren't doing any of this. They're not doing any of this. And she goes, no, none. I said, well, if I can prove that I can save money, and I can prove that, like, through my study, my PhD research, that I can produce these results and prevent the falls and save the money, wouldn't it make sense for the system to pay me? She goes, yes, it would, but they won't. That was one of the big reasons why I ended up going to chiropractic college.
Yeah, it's mad. It was around the same time as that Magna Report that there was also a shift in the way that we looked at, and I know we're talking a lot about back pain here today, the context, but it was also around that same time that a couple of other ideas really came into place. The first was this idea that back pain was self-limiting, that, just given enough time, it disappears. And along with that went a shift with what was beforehand recognized that, we might have 20 or 30 visits over a 60, 90-day period that somehow went down to 3 to 5. Can you kind of weave some of all of that together in terms of, because this is where we're stuck at now, or many chiropractors, and like, where did this idea come from? And then it's a deck of cards that it's built upon there too, and you do such a good job of exposing that.
Sure. So a couple of things happened. So 93 Magna, I mean, it was, shot, kind of heard around the world, but before that was published in 93, the big one was the Mead study published in the British Medical Journal, which was the first time in a peer-reviewed clinical, highly, high reputation medical journal that a properly controlled trial was published about chiropractic. It was conducted by medical doctors, and of course the conclusion was that chiropractic was better than the usual outpatient care. And they did a follow-up to that as well, and showed that the results stayed. So things were happening around this time. So you got to know your history a little bit. So Wilkes wins against the AMA, right? You've got the New Zealand Inquiry 79, then Wilkes wins against the AMA in 87, wins the appeal in 90. Supreme Court won't even hear it later. Then Mead study comes out in 1990. Then the Magna Report comes out in 1993. I mean, they were reeling because what they were able to do before was to say it's quackery. It's a joke. It doesn't work. And then all of a sudden now they have no evidence. And then, all of a sudden we're producing evidence. So there was a huge movement that you saw come along, which was that first was we were, it was going to be self-limiting. Right. So there's no point because Tylenol is the gold standard, or acetaminophen or paracetamol is the gold standard. It was published as the gold standard of care in every basically clinical guideline around the world. There was not one single randomized controlled trial on paracetamol. It's now considered guideline discordant since the Chow review in 2017. But before that, Davies et al. In 2008 basically said, maybe we should look at this because it's the standard of care in every evidence-based clinical guideline around the world. There's not a single study. Do you think that they couldn't figure out how to do a placebo-controlled trial with Tylenol?
Yeah,
they hadn't done
simple.
one. Of course, they had done them. They hadn't published them. And they finally did one on some military people, and they showed a delayed healing. But anyway, it was considered the gold standard, right? And everyone was saying, you got to have more evidence. Why would we spend this much money on chiropractic when we can spend 10 cents on a Tylenol and it does just as well? Chiropractic might be as good, but it's not better. You've heard this, I'm sure, a million times, of course. Anyway, they won't even compare chiropractic to usual medical care anymore head to head. They will not do it. They will always either go chiropractic and usual medical care versus usual medical care, or that, because they won't do it. Since the Bishop study in 2010, when we were 2,700% better, they will not do it. They're not stupid, these people. Right. So then what they did was they said, well, back pain gets better on its own. And they published this in evidence-based guidelines all around the world. And chiropractors published it. It was published in JMPT, this nonsense. What was the data for that? Zero. You know what the data was? They used data where if people stopped going to the medical doctor, they called them better. But what was happening, of course, is people stopped going because it wasn't working. But they categorized these people as better. So et al. Did a paper in 2012 where they absolutely just dismantled this absurd belief. And they say outright in the paper, again, these are all in my research reviews. I know we're going to talk about that, but people need to read this stuff, Angus. Like if you don't know this stuff, how can you be certain? How can you have that swagger that you need? Like you need, as I always say, FU certainty in chiropractic, because you're the underdog. Yeah. So you need to be more aware of the advantage of your product and service than anybody else has, because you're the underdog. You're the uncola, right? And so just you need to know this. And so anyway, so et al. Basically said, look, this is garbage. It looks, and as it turns out, it looks like. And of course, I used to argue and stand up in these seminars with all these apparently so-called evidence-based people, and I would say, well, how do you explain that chronic back pain is on an exponential kind of increase that is really becoming pandemic worldwide? If acute care is self-resolving, if acute back pain is self-resolving, how can we get an increase in chronic back pain, you morons? And of course, they would cluck like chickens, but couldn't answer me. And so finally, it came out and said, no, this isn't true. These people, there's no evidence whatsoever that these people are better. They just stopped care. And it turns out, when we did a proper study, that about 65 to 75% of them go chronic. Yeah. And so the idea that it's self-resolving, in fact, I had a client down in Australia who was brought up before a board in Australia, Angus. And they were told, they got in trouble because they didn't tell the patient that without care it would self-resolve. They told the patient that it was better to get care, and they got called up in front of the board. So I sent him the IT study. I sent them the Croft study. There's two of them, and basically the board just backed down and said, we didn't know that. But these people, board members aren't experts in science, right? They're just chiropractors. You decide they're going to go on a board. Doesn't mean to say they have bad intentions, but they just go along with what they've heard. They have no evidence to back it up. And they were literally going to sanction this chiropractor. And had that chiropractor not been a client of mine, they never, in fact, they were a client of mine. They still had to give me an email and I helped them out, but they won instantly. They just said, oh, I see. Evidence matters, man. It's power.
Hugely. You talked about before this idea of swagger or certainty, or showing up with the FU attitude there as well. It is something that, as each generation goes on in chiropractic, it just is dissipating more and more.
We used to have I get better results FU, right? And now, because most chiropractors who go to chiropractic school now are not the sons or daughters of chiropractors. They're not third generation chiropractors. They don't walk in with that certainty of knowing how great it works because they haven't seen it. And so now they're trying to figure out that they're trying to get certainty from evidence, but the evidence they're being shared with the chiropractic college is criminally, like, it's malpractice how little evidence they actually get on this stuff and how biased what they're learning is. So now how are you going to have certainty coming out of a school that says what you do is no different than physical therapy and no better?
Well, one of the zones of genius that you have, and I missed this for a long time, is that when you're reading papers, what they would do is that they would test a trial of chiropractic care that would be 3 to 5 to 10 to 12 visits. And the question they were asking,
10 to 12 now.
yeah, no, certainly. But the question they'd ask was, did it help? Not did it solve the problem? And I didn't realize the distinction between those two, because you're right, 3 to 5 visits with most people starts to give them some results. And so therefore that became the recommendations. But the question was never asked, what does it take to get resolution of this? And that's like in the rest of healthcare, that's the question we're asking. What does it take to get somebody back to borderline, healthy physiology? That's what we'd be looking at, certainly if it was a pharmaceutical intervention. And so many
I love how they say you need to take these blood pressure or cholesterol pills, which by the way are useless and harmful, but you need to take these for the rest of your life. Yes. But if a chiropractor suggests you might need care regularly for the rest of your life, that's quackery.
Yes.
It's almost like the COVID thing, right? Like the thing that they get people to believe is almost, it's hard to understand how people could even on its face not see it as absurdity, right? But again, it's that cultural authority. It's the environment they're taught in. It's this, it's just this constant sort of berating of chiropractic that they get at chiropractic college, right?
Well, it's a very definition of Marty Seligman's learned helplessness. We get belted a few times and then we just stay there. And unless we're lucky enough to come in contact with somebody like you to listen and then to put the time and effort in to actually learn this stuff there too, to build up that swagger and confidence. Because there is, and part of this, if today's conversation intrigues you, the seminar that I did with James earlier in Sydney, well, as you listen to this, was last year. He does around the world, and he's back in Australia again in March, along with Brad Glowacki, who's one of the best communicators going around in terms of, I don't want to use the word weaponizing this. It's a bit kind of, but he gives you great communication strategies to go, right, here's the science behind it and here's the communication towards it as well. Tell us a little bit about kind of what goes on at if someone wants to dive deeper in and spend the day with you and Brad, what goes on at the Best Practices seminar?
Yeah, so it'll be 2 days. And so basically what we've done is we've said, I'm gonna come in and talk about all the science and show them all the papers about exactly, how do you determine if someone has a clinical need for chiropractic care? How do you determine what that dose of those care recommendations should be? What is the evidence for the things that you're competing against? And so it's not possible in that 2-day seminar to leave and not go, holy cow, I'm the most evidence-based practitioner in the history of healthcare. It's just not possible. Right. And then the other half of that is exactly what you said. Brad's then saying, okay, here's how you take that and turn it into an ethical millionaire practice. Here's how you communicate it. Here's how you have confidence when you're delivering that care plan that's based on evidence and all those things. So it's just a real combination of the why and what, and then Brad does the how.
Yes.
And as you know, he's very good at it, but listening to it together on the same weekend is mind blowing for people.
Yeah, incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about too, because you've just finished at the time of listening to this too, putting together a white paper where you go over some of the, the clinical evidence that we've talked about. So if chiropractors are wanting to kind of bone up on this, you go, great. What are the papers I should read? And what do I need to actually make myself bulletproof? What do I need with that too? Can you tell us a little bit about the white paper and how does someone go about getting that?
Sure. So I've had a couple of people struggle because they're being, I guess, audited would be maybe the term or whatever it is, or being pressure coerced by third-party payers to give less care. And of course, they ask me, what should I say? And I say, tell them to fuck off. Excuse my language, but that's what I say. Tell them to fuck off. And they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, because their data is fraud. You can't have a third-party payer tell you what the average number of visits is when they write people letters if they see people over a certain number of visits. That's not data from a study that's asking what the proper dose of care is. That's data saying, can we manipulate people into providing less care? And I said, you have a moral and ethical and legal obligation to be an advocate for your patient. If you decide to stay in their, if you get coerced and you want to stay on their, good list, and you sell out your patients when there's clinical need for care, and you decide not to give that care because you want to stay on the provider list, you should go to jail. You just sold out, right? Anymore. That's as unethical or worse than giving too much care, because they go, oh, all of a sudden, oh, I see you have 24 visits covered by your insurance. I'm going to give you 24 visits. I recommend 12 for the other people, but I'm going to give you 24 because they'll pay for it. That's disgusting too. But this idea that a third-party payer has any effing clue about whether or not there's clinical need, or what the actual literature says about what the expected frequency or dose of care is required to get to maximum therapeutic benefit, they're clueless. So if I may just talk a little bit, with your permission, Angus, about that 3 to 5 visit mythology.
Yeah,
stuff.
please.
So first of all, there's only one paper in the history of chiropractic that's valid in terms of actually asking the question, is there a dose response to chiropractic care? Like, what's the ideal dose of care for chiropractic, just for the beginning, not to maximum therapeutic benefit, but just at the beginning. And that's the Haas paper in 2014, HAAS. And so everything else was based on consensus documents. So what these people did, there's a few people who said, well, the average number of visits in chiropractic studies is 5. Therefore, clearly, that's the average number of visits required. Well, no, those chiropractic studies aren't asking the question, what's the dose of care required for maximum therapeutic benefit? They're saying this predetermined amount of care, let's call it 3 visits, 5 visits, 8, this predetermined amount of care. The question is, does this predetermined amount of care make a statistical change to the outcomes we've decided to measure? That's all they ask. They have no idea. If anybody's suggesting that's evidence of the dose of care required to get somebody resolved, that's ridiculous. They don't go to resolution. These studies aren't, hey, let's give these patients to a chiropractor, let them go to resolution, and then look at the average number of visits it took to get to resolution. They didn't do that at all. That's never been done in the history of our profession. So anybody who claims that they can use that data to determine what the dose of care requirement is an idiot, or a liar, or both. 100%. Like, scientific idiocy. Second thing is, these consensus documents are just that. They're consensus documents. And in fact, if you look at like the RAND panel or these other ones, they vary from sort of like 1 to 28 visits. These expert panels, it depends who's the expert on the panel. They're absurd because they have no data to draw from. Just like when they were trying to claim that chiropractic caused stroke and then figuring out what the rate was. Well, there's no data. So how can you just have to make this shit up? And they do all the time. And so, like, you can't go by a consensus panel. That's absurd. So, and at the end of the day, what's left? Well, there's one study. And basically what Haas says is, it looks like after 12 visits, you could think that half of your patients would be half better. Half better after 12. Yeah. That's half of them. And again, it's not a linear response. We all know that the first half of improvement comes quicker than the second half. That's true of training physically, for aerobically or strength or whatever else. That changes fast at the beginning and then kind of levels off. It's usually not linear, right? And so, you can think, even if it was linear, you're looking at 24 visits to get half of them better. The other half is what? More. How much more? We don't know. And then you look at the Senna and Macaulay study and they're like, well, wait a minute. If you stop at 12 visits and don't get any more care, you go back to pre-care status by the end of the year. If you get care every 2 weeks, you not only keep your improvements, you continue to improve even more. Only one valid study ever done on maintenance care. That's it. So there's some pretty good. Now, that's the best available evidence. If something new comes out, obviously we take that data and we incorporate it into our care plans. But that's the best available data. Most people don't even know this. They actually believe that if someone tells them, it's 3 to 5 visits, they believe it. It's bizarre.
Well, I think we've just been fed this stuff so often, and until somebody comes up and clears this up, there's such an enthusiasm that we should have for stepping into a report of findings, and not based on philosophy, but like, let me give you, as you talk about, let me give you statistically the very best chance that you have of getting better. And this is
Yeah,
not based on my opinion. This is not based on philosophy. This is what the science tells us. And then
right.
we go in
Right.
without.
Congratulations. You're in the best place to give you the best statistical chance to ever get better. You just stepped into like the dream world for you. This is the greatest thing that's ever happened to you. Right. I mean, it's an incredible moment for that patient, right? And you got chiropractors humming and hawing with their face down, either just making shit up.
Mm,
You got to come 80 visits and you got to pay me ahead of time, or basically come a couple times and see if it works. I mean, both of those things are outrageous, and
yes.
it's like, well, what? Because they're not aware of the evidence, so they're going in based, and they're basing their care recommendations on what, Angus? And there's no
Mm,
reason they can't learn this stuff. There's no reason it shouldn't be taught in chiropractic college, but there's an agenda, right? And the agenda is those people who are recommending 3 to 5, they're saying we want insurance to like us. We want to be liked by medicine and blah, blah, blah. Well, go to a physical therapist, you get 12 visits usually. You know what I mean? Right. And a
mm,
physical therapist, if your elbow can't go through full range of motion, or your hip or your ankle, and it doesn't hurt, they don't say, well, it doesn't hurt, no care. They say it doesn't hurt yet, but it's going to hurt because we got to reestablish proper mobility and motion and neurology, and it's going to be painful, but it's worth it. Correct? And
100%.
chiropractors are afraid to do that to the synovial joints of the spine. They're
Mm,
told that, oh my gosh, if it doesn't hurt, don't touch it. It might hurt. Of course, it's going to hurt.
mm,
Should. Breaking up scar tissue, you're creating an acute inflammatory response, which is required to heal. Motion is, everybody knows that if you lack motion or mobility in any synovial joint, it degenerates, it gets inflamed, right? It loses function. That's fact. That's not maybe, that's fact. Well, how is that not possible? That also relates to the spinal joints. They're synovial joints.
mm. Yeah,
And
well,
so it's bizarre what people have been coerced into believing or bullied into believing. But there's that side, and the other side is they're lazied into being bullied. They're not doing the work. Be Charles frickin' Atlas. Go down and work out. If you're getting bullied, you need to, before you punch that bully in the face, maybe you should go train a little bit. And chiropractors don't train, Angus. You know what I mean?
yeah.
They don't train intellectually in terms of making sure they know this evidence. And I mean, I've done everything I can to feed it to people. I mean,
Mm,
you know what I mean? It's sitting there. I got all these things there for people. They don't have to go find the studies. They don't have to do all this stuff. And so I get frustrated, as you can probably tell, because I get so many emails, Angus, about people who are struggling from ignorance,
mm.
period. I mean, that might be unkind to some. It's not as honest. Chiropractors struggle from ignorance. And so you just need to be aware of how great you are. You just need to be aware of the evidence that shows you're the patient's best chance. And when you know that because of evidence, it changes who you are.
It it breaks my heart too to see really good chiropractors getting out of practice, struggling in practice. The rate of our young chiropractors not being chiropractors within 36 months of investing.
Isn't it
What's
half,
now?
Angus? Isn't it half?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's
yeah. It
half.
is. It's wild.
Yeah. And in the States, that comes around with about 300,000 US debt. I know it's less
Yeah,
in Australia and Canada. In Canada, it's 150. And
yeah.
so
It's about
imagine that.
100 here.
Imagine spending 4 years and you go there, and basically at the end you're taught that you're no better or different than a physical therapist who went to school for 2 years, not four. They get a
Mm,
master's degree from the Faculty of Medicine, usually, at least they do in BC, and they
mm,
spend 1/4 of the money, half the
yeah,
time, 1/4 of the money, master's degree from the Faculty of Medicine, and as many referrals as they can accept.
yeah. Well,
So come on, man.
yeah. Look, I think for those of you that are Aussies and perhaps Kiwis and some of Asia that can reasonably travel here, March 9 and 10 is when James and
Seventh,
Brad,
eighth,
sorry,
eighth,
March 7 and
eighth.
8, March
Yeah,
7 and
seventh,
8
eighth.
are when they're in Sydney. Please go along to that. I did a version of that without Brad last year, and it was stunning. The other thing I want to encourage people to do is James has some incredible resources on his website. I'm going to have links for everything in terms of where you register for that too.
Sure.
innatechoiceaustralia.com is where you register for that too. The white paper we talked about beforehand is part of James's research review bundles, the clinical evidence for chiropractors. there's online learning modules there, which, you know, I've just worked my way through one of them after our seminar, which was, I think it was 10 videos, which is, please just go there, check out this stuff and invest in it, because it'll give you the certainty and confidence. It'll give you the swagger. It'll bring a whole bunch of enjoyment back. And if none of that stuff is important to you, okay, it'll help you save a lot more lives. Like ignore that. If you won't do it for you to have all those things, there are people in your community that need you to know this, so you can recommend and you can show up the right way, so you can stop them going down a fucking rabbit hole that has them in a nightmare afterwards. So,
and Angus, their staff needs to learn it from their doctor.
Yeah.
Right. You want to have authority with your staff, and you want your staff to be proud of you and proud of chiropractic and be a team member, not an employee. They need to know about the evidence for chiropractic. It's staggering what a difference it makes when the doc learns it and then teaches it. Staggering difference.
Yeah. James, I'm beyond a raving fan of yours. I'm deeply grateful for all that you've done.
That's kind. Thank you.
I can't imagine the sleepless nights, the frustration that you have been through to kind of know something so clearly and to be able to articulate it so well, and for it not to have been taken on must be heartbreaking at times for you.
Well, there's enough great stories, Angus, to be honest with you, right? Like, you know, one of the great blessings of my life is that are the thousands of emails I get from people saying that it did make a difference, that they did stay in practice, that they are having a happier chiropractic life with more pride because of it. So although I guess the frustration sometimes drives me to get out there, even though I don't always like to leave home or to, you know, the truth is that I've had enough money. I've had enough, you know, life-changing, you know, philosophy. I've had enough great care from chiropractic, enough great friendships, and enough great positive feedback that I don't need any more. Yeah. And I want to be sure that I communicate just what chiropractic has done for me and my family. Like I've got no bitching to do. I'm just frustrated on behalf of the other chiropractors, you know, more than I am with them, you know. Yeah. I just want better. I just want better for them, because I see what it does when they get that evidence-based certainty. I see what it does for their life, and it's very hard to be a chiropractor in this world because you don't have that instant cultural authority. You don't have that instant respect. You know, now I know your patients love you, but it's just rare to see a chiropractor without this certainty that's really happy in practice, right? Yeah. And you deserve to be happy in practice. You deserve to be proud of what you do and to have a great confidence and pride in the service that you provide, because it is phenomenal. It's phenomenal, and it's not the same as physical therapy. And you're not a physical therapist. You know, everything is centered around the adjustment.
Yeah. Well, James, I cannot improve on that, buddy. Thank you for all that you do. I look forward to seeing you. I'll be there back again in Sydney next year. And
all right, dinner on me, mate. Dinner on me. I'm sure I owe you one.
My kids there. Yeah.
No way.
Great. I would let you bite. Yeah. But thank you, buddy. Again. So, gang, all the links necessary to all this stuff will be in the show notes there as well.
Yeah, I'll give you the ones for North America too, like because we're doing London Heathrow in February as well, and that's on the U.S. website. So I think you have them all. If not, I'll email them to you, and then in case where they are in the world, because I know you have a worldwide audience, so that at least they can get the website that's appropriate for them.
Love it, buddy. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Me too. Thanks.
If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come and check out my Community Influencer program. It's my monthly coaching program where we take all this material and I'll work with you to help you apply it, implement it, and systemize it. The Community Influencer Group Coaching program is designed to help you increase your practice income, impact, and enjoyment. Join me over at anguspyke.com/join. That's anguspyke.com/join. I'd love to see you there.